Is Alexander Vindman, and I will now introduce the program that will become our radio show in just a matter, and our podcast in just a matter of a few days. Ukraine has moved from the fringes to the center of the American news diet, crowding out the pandemic and inflation and politics, at least for now. Maybe you started to pay more attention in late 2013 and into 2014, when the Maidan uprising turned central Kyiv into a battleground and eventually pushed a Russian-backed president from office. Or in 2019, seems like a long time ago now, doesn't it? When President Trump first was impeached, accused of trying to muscle the newly elected Ukrainian president, a young actor named Volodymyr Zelensky, you know that name now, into investigating Joe Biden and his son Hunter. The blocked supply of weapons needed to hold off separatist militias and unmarked Russian soldiers who were breaking off a chunk of eastern Ukraine was dangled as an inducement, along with a White House visit. One of the reasons anyone outside the White House even knew what had happened in that phone call was that a career Army officer assigned to the National Security Council, a specialist in the region, and an immigrant to the U.S. from Ukraine started to talk about what he had heard. The call, the blocked weapons shipment, the impeachment, made for an uncomfortable time in U.S.-Ukrainian relations, put the Trump presidency in the history books and changed the life of my guest, Alexander Vindman, now a retired Army lieutenant colonel, and today arguably the best-known grad student in America. He's working on a PhD at the School for Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. He's the author of a memoir and a contemporary history, Here, Right Matters. It's good to talk to you again. Welcome to World Affairs.
Thanks, Ray. Looking forward to this conversation.
Well, let's talk about the invasion and current war later in the program and your thoughts about what the U.S. needs to do right now and the possible fates of Russia and Ukraine. But first, let's start with your own story and the years leading up to the Russian invasion. One of the more remarkable aspects of the Trump impeachment is the 10,000-watt spotlight it shone on three high-achieving Americans, experts in their respective fields, telling a devastating story about how Donald Trump's team was conducting American foreign policy, and all three were immigrants to the United States. Marie Yovanovitch, then the recently fired U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Fiona Hill, a Russia specialist on the National Security Council staff, and you, Director of European Affairs for the NSC. Amazing coincidence, but also I think it said something about America, about the kind of country this is. It's hard to think of another place in the world where the political fate of a national leader could wind up in the hands of naturalized citizens. Did you think about that right then?
I didn't, but at some point in the past, I had considered this very, very unique feature that I, as an immigrant, as a refugee from the Soviet Union, was serving in the United States Army with the highest level clearances, working in the Pentagon, facing off against the Russians at negotiating tables. And then same thing with regards to the White House and the National Security Council, and that it was completely implausible for the Russians to operate in the same way. The authoritarian regime, scared to death of its own people exercising freedoms, allowing an immigrant from anywhere, even internal to Russia, non kind of not the right kind of Russian into those kind of hallowed halls, or from an immigrant from a region. It's just not possible. It's a uniqueness about the United States and our openness and our embrace of people from around the world that kind of volunteer to be Americans. I was too young to kind of do that in a thoughtful way, and then welcoming them in with all the opportunities that this country's promised to so many immigrants throughout the decades and centuries. It's a very, very unique. That's why I remain so optimistic about America and the American people, is that this is a land of opportunity in a lot of ways, different levels of effort, of course, from different elements of society. I think it's easier for a white population than it is for a minority population, but still, based on diligence, hard work, achievements, being able to get to anywhere.
Your family left the Black Sea port city of Odessa to come to the American port city of New York. What year was that?
So that was 1979. My roots in Odessa actually go back. I was born in Kiev, the capital. That's now the subject of news. But you're right. Actually, I do have roots. Supposedly, back in the beginning of the 20th century, when it was still the Russian Empire, my family was part of the merchant guild. So we have roots in that part of Odessa. And then we moved to Little Odessa, which is the kind of the alias for Brighton Beach in New York.
You were very young when you arrived. Did that make the transition easier?
It made it very easy. I think we arrived in the U.S. just sometime a little bit after I turned 4, so I didn't have any formal schooling. Technically, my first language was Russian, but I don't know if you could really claim that as a 4-year-old. I grew up in the U.S. Speaking English. My Russian faculty facility is based on the fact that my parents insisted on speaking Russian to us, which was a very excellent idea on their part that armed me to have a successful career working on Russia, Ukraine, and so forth. But I have this. It's a complex question for me to answer because I never really considered myself to be Ukrainian. Certainly, growing up, I bought into the Russian propaganda about how the Ukrainian people mistreated the Jewish population through pogroms and things of that nature, which is a vast oversimplification of the history. The Russians were as complicit, if not more complicit, in those pogroms. And I tended to identify myself as a Russian Jew or a Soviet Jew or something of that nature. But as I learned more about my region, about my background, I definitely, I lifted the blinders and was able to understand that, that frankly, if there was any allegiance to that part of the world, as somebody that was raised in the U.S. but had roots in that part of the world, it was not to Russia. It was to Ukraine, a noble people that have shown their mettle recently in this war, and something that I've probably increasingly embraced, that I'm a Ukrainian American, or an American of Ukrainian origins is what I prefer to say, because the American part always goes first.
Your father had been a senior civil engineer in Ukraine, well trained, climbing the ladder as it was in the Soviet Union in that era. Would you have, despite systemic anti-Semitism, have lived what passed for a decent Soviet life in the years to come, a cut above in housing, schooling, a vacation home? Would your family, compared to a lot of others, have done pretty well if your father hadn't decided to pull the plug and make the tough decision to start over in another part of the world?
So I think I'll take my dad's judgment on this above my own. I'd like to think that hard work would carry me through. I'd like to think that maybe my dad's hard work would kind of shelter me and offer me some opportunities. But his own conclusion is no. That the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, that the Russians, the Soviet Union, was looking to stifle the prospects of the Jewish population, and was putting quotas on how many folks could attend the best universities or could fill particular roles. So I think my father's judgment was clearly that we were not going to have the same kind of comfortable life or successful career that he had, and that's why that's part of the reason that the U.S. established this program where refugees were welcomed from that part of the world, because of anti-Semitism, and subjecting the Jewish population in the Soviet Union to anti-Semitism and to don't know,
Well, this
persecution,
was,
religious
yeah.
persecution, really.
Well, this was part of a periodic, there were all during the Cold War freezes and thaws. What came to be known as the Jackson-Vanik Amendment was appended to trade law. So the Soviet Union was offered liberalized trade in return for allowing freer Jewish emigration to Israel and the United States. I'm a little older than you, and just a couple of neighborhoods over. So I remember when Brooklyn was filling up with newly arrived Russian speakers from several Soviet republics, eventually in the hundreds of thousands. You were in what, high school when the Soviet Union finally came apart? Do you remember that time well?
I do remember it relatively well. So, I mean, it started to come apart. I started to take note and pay attention in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down. At that point, I was a freshman in high school, and I certainly noticed kind of the Iron Curtain falling, Soviet power waning, and then a pretty rapid devolution in the 90s, in 1990, in 1991, and a very precipitous collapse in 1991. I think that shocked a large portion of the world, although probably not, from my research for my dissertation, not a lot of people in government. I think that, one of the things I discovered is that there were these groups that were looking at the collapse of the Soviet Union, the potential collapse of the Soviet Union, and preparing contingency plans, if not in the, publicly or amongst the broader set of government officials, at least in a way to deal with these geopolitical earthquakes. So I started paying attention to it, probably kind of about the same time that the U.S. government started to pay attention to the potential end of the Soviet Union.
Well, after public high school in Brooklyn, you head to college and Army or ROTC. When did your background, your language skills, your military vocation sort of combine and push you in the direction of becoming a specialist in the part of the world where you were born?
So I'd say the first, decade, 7 years or so of my military career were more of a conventional troop leader, infantry officer, platoon leader in Korea, executive officer, company commander. But somewhere along the way, there was always an opportunity to contribute with my language facility. At that point, there were some exchange programs. I remember when I was serving in Germany, still as an infantryman, there was an exercise, of kind of a strategic exercise called Torgau, where Russian senior generals would come in and meet with U.S. generals. This was before the Georgian War, so this is 2007, and have these exchanges. And I remember, basically being voluntold. I was happy to do it, but voluntold to kind of translate and escort. And that was about the same time that I started considering where I could make the biggest contribution. There are hundreds, thousands of infantrymen, infantry officers, and I really enjoyed being a troop leader. It was challenging, exciting. Going to Ranger School, going to Airborne School, serving in combat. But I started to reflect on where I could make the biggest contribution. And I decided I could do that as a soldier, statesman, as a foreign area officer, a officer that has diplomat, like a large diplomatic purview and portfolio. And I transitioned into that specialty.
I want to ask you something I recently asked Ambassador Michael McFaul, for a time the U.S. ambassador to Russia, who at the time of the breakup of the USSR was a young scholar living in Moscow, had a front seat to history. Did the U.S., giddy with its perceived victory in the Cold War, watching the painful reinvention of a humiliated country, really understand what was happening in Russia? Did the U.S. play its hand properly? Could things have gone a different way?
Oh, absolutely. First, let me say that Mike McFaul is a dear friend and mentor. He's the one that I remember floating the idea of maybe going to the National Security Council when I was sitting at his residence having coffee in, I think, 2014 or so. And he was like, sure, that's a great idea. I think I definitely support you. So he and I have definitely stayed in contact over the years. He started studying this as a scholar, as you pointed out, in the 90s when I was still getting my feet under me with my academic pursuits. But in my research for my dissertation, I could say that it's a combination of failures. It's for where we ended up with regards to Russia. Certainly, we had high hopes and expectations on working with the Russian government to transform Russia into a democratic state. We put a fairly significant amount of resources behind it. Certainly, our concepts were very, very open-minded, but we didn't put enough like material resources behind it. We did not partner with the Russians the way we could have. We did not, conceive of a Marshall Plan because we were in the midst of our own recessions and stuff like that. We kind of were doing a little bit of navel gazing to help transform Russia in a critical period of time, in that 1992 period, 1993 period, when we really could have, proven the mettle of democracy and what it could mean for prosperity. So we failed there. And then as Russia started to kind of retrench back to its comfort zone, security state, because it was an incomplete revolution. The Communist Party fell apart, but the apparatchiks, the elites, maintained power, and they were able to kind of jockey for position and ultimately gain strength, husband their strength to reassert themselves. As that process started to unfold, we were subject to some wishful thinking. We didn't want to, Bill Clinton didn't want to burn his relationship with Boris Yeltsin. So there was a lot of kind of tiptoeing around Russia's democratic backsliding. But there was a reason to do that, though. I think there was a reason for U.S. optimism. There was a reason for, Russian kind of entrenched elites to try to hang on to power in the 90s. Where it became a little bit less logical and problematic is when you get to the 2000s and the rise of Vladimir Putin. That the indicators we should have started to cast aside some of our wishful thinking about Russia and its directions. Under Vladimir Putin, Russia had started to engage in very provocative behavior. They crushed, private property rights, the interest of oligarchs, waged a very devastating war against their own population in Chechnya, and attempted to interfere in Ukrainian elections that resulted in the Orange Revolution, war on Georgia, all sorts of assassination attempts using chemical agents. We let these things slide, and that's probably because we were effectively manipulated by the KGB case officer Vladimir Putin, that preyed on our hopes of having a good relationship with Russia, which were misplaced, and our fears of a devolving relationship with a nuclear power. And he was effectively able to manipulate that and stay our hand when we should have adhered to our kind of principles. And that continued on through the 2010s under President Obama, and accelerated in a catastrophic way under Trump.
Ukraine had begun life as a separate entity early in the 1990s, negotiated its way out of the USSR, made deals with the Russian Federation having to do with the divvying up of the Navy, allowed Russians the use of a Black Sea port, the transfer of its nuclear arsenal to the Russians. A big country, a major supplier of such things as grain and cooking oil, but also home to a lot of heavy industry. It had more going for it after its birth pangs than a lot of its peer newly independent countries. Yet, as you just mentioned, it had growing pains and some difficult times early on in its nationhood.
Yep. Well, so the history between Russia and Ukraine goes back 1,000 years. It's a struggle for hegemony between what was the predecessor to Moscow and the predecessor to Ukraine. At one point, actually, Ukraine was dominant, but it was 700 years ago. The city was destroyed by the Mongol hordes, and then Russia came to ascend. At one point, there was a parity between the two countries, and there was a long struggle for Ukraine's independence under a different kind of state. Russia ended up coming out on top there. So that unfolded about 300 years ago, and Russia started to build these links with Ukraine and subordinate Ukraine for a long, long time. That project played out all the way through the 20th century, with Ukraine fitfully attempting to assert its independence. They had a brief period of 3 years of independence after World War One, but the Red Army crushed and seized Ukraine and made it a communist state. And that history, what we should learn from that history is that, that's a long period of time for Russia to try to kind of build networks and centralize Ukraine towards Moscow. And that's a lot for a young country to overcome. It didn't have an independent, political elite that was able to conduct foreign policy. Didn't really have a military to speak of. It took the remnants of the Soviet military to build its military in 1991, 1992. And that was a struggle for the first 10 years. Really, it took 10 years for Ukraine to get its feet under it. And then by the time you get to about more like 15, by the time you get to 2004, they're paving their own way. They have a different identity. They have a different understanding of who they are. They're unique, separate from Russia. And Russia feels its grasp weakening on Ukraine. Ukraine slipping through its fingers, but still has that hundreds of years mindset of Ukraine as Little Russia. That's what it was known as. You have Great Russia, which is Moscow. You have Little Russia, which is Ukraine, and you had Belorussia, which is the country of Belarus. So that is something that the Russians have not shed. Their sense of exceptionalism and the dominant power in the Russian world. Ukraine shed it decades ago when it came to its independence, and right now that was a peaceful breakup of Russia and the Soviet Union. Now the Ukrainians are fighting for their independence 30 years after they declared it.
Let's turn to the phone call that you say changed your life. You had written talking points for the president in his phone meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky. He didn't use them. You had goals and objectives for the first encounter between the two leaders. They were not achieved. You sat there and you heard President Trump pressuring President Zelensky. Did you immediately understand what you heard as improper? Or did it take some reflection after hashing it out with others?
No, I mean, I understood it as improper immediately. As a matter of fact, this was the second encounter with President Zelensky. The first one was months before, on April 21st, 2019, when President Trump actually did, more closely execute the phone call, this congratulatory phone call, saying, "Hey, good job, President Zelensky. You won a landslide victory. You have a lot of work to do. Keep up the reforms, anti-corruption measures, but America is your friend and ally." So that was aligned with U.S. policy. That was aligned with trying to strengthen Ukraine, trying to avoid the war that we have now by helping Ukraine reform, warning off Russia. By the time we get to the second phone call, months down the road, what is that? 3 months down the road, a lot of the policy unraveled. Unraveled because President Trump saw an opportunity to advance his own schemes for a 2020 election, to steal an election, cast a shadow over President Biden. And I watched this unfold over the course of months. Now, I stubbornly refused to believe that the President of the United States would be directly involved. I knew that a lot of his henchmen were directly involved. Mick Mulvaney, who is his chief of staff, Rudy Giuliani, who is his personal attorney, a bunch of other people were involved, because as this scheme, this freezing of aid unfolded, I pulled this enterprise out of the shadows. I was in a senior role, not a lieutenant colonel, but a director on the National Security Council, equivalent to a 3-star. So I was able to use the power of the National Security Council to make people go on record, to offer their considered views on what we should be doing with Russia, and kind of map it out where everybody focused on national security was supportive of supporting Ukraine, foreseeing the dangers of Russia potentially escalating its war on Ukraine, and then the president, for his own personal schemes, looking to caring less about U.S. national security, caring only about his personal interests. So the only piece that was out of place, the only piece of the puzzle that was not there was whether the president was directly involved, even though I had heard people give me accounts that the president was the one that was ordering it. Was the president on July 25th going on the record? And for me, my obligations were not, a loyalty to the president above loyalty to the Constitution. I knew what my responsibilities were, and when I reported this phone call, it was not, to punish the president, like, reporting him to a police to kind of arrest him. It was to convince him to reverse course, saying, Mr. President, this is wrong. This is criminal. If this becomes public, you'll be impeached. I have that line. I said that to my twin brother, but I also said it to these senior officials that I reported the president's phone call to. The intent was really to get him to reverse course. And my belief was that that was not unlikely. He had changed he did flip-flopped on U.S. policies many times because he was notorious for making bad decisions and changing his mind when somebody brought it to his attention. That was the intent. He didn't, because his interests were on tarnishing President Biden. That was the overriding concern, to prevent him from being a viable candidate going into 2020. And ultimately, it required congressional investigation and an impeachment to expose this whole matter.
Did you realize the risk that you were putting your career and eventually even other kinds of threats began to come in, that this was a momentous step that would reshape whatever was coming in the future?
I definitely knew it was momentous. I remember walking into my twin brother's office and saying, if what I'm about to tell you is ever revealed in public, the president would be impeached. So I knew the import. I knew, what the president had done was a historical transgression, a historical abuse of power. My concerns for myself, I thought, that most, frankly, at that time, there was some wishful thinking. I thought my concerns were that, when I was reporting the phone call, that it would jeopardize my office, my position in the White House. That the president is notoriously vindictive. I very well maybe ending my stint there, which was not an easy thing to do because I loved my job. It was having an impact, but it was not something I was going to put in front of my obligations to the American people, to the Constitution. But
in the years since, the phone call and its aftermath has been minimized by many supporters of the president, who say this wasn't really a problem because Ukraine got the weapons eventually. The hold was lifted, so no harm done. Is that true?
It's not. It is not true. I think one of the consequences of this that president's corruption, President Trump's corruption, is that he made the relationship with Ukraine radioactive. It wasn't just the fact that from a practical standpoint, that the aid was frozen and then unfrozen. It's that for the rest of the Trump administration, Ukraine was demonized by the Republican Party, demonized by President Trump. And it was radioactive actually under the Biden administration also, because there was a lot of baggage from that Ukraine scandal and these claims of wrongdoing by completely unsubstantiated claims of wrongdoing by President Biden. So even the Biden administration kind of held President Zelensky and Ukraine at arm's length. And that really directly set the conditions for President Putin to believe Ukraine is vulnerable. Ukraine wouldn't get the support, that the cost of conducting this offensive against Ukraine would be minimal because Ukraine was radioactive, because the Trump administration, his proxies, his henchmen, Mike Pompeo, Tucker Carlson, and his mouthpiece, Ron Johnson, the Ted Cruz's, Josh Hawley's of the world, were damning Ukraine and cheerleading Russia. And this played out all the way through the hours prior to the war. So when Putin had to make a decision about whether to conduct this war, he didn't have to contend with the kind of monolithic, united front of the American government, Congress, in opposition to his aggression. He had every confidence that the U.S. was going to be divided. There was I remember I was advocating for this bill to levy sanctions against President Putin, to signal that there would be a very heavy cost for this war, and the Republicans were impeding it. There's no way that Putin and his folks missed this. That this encouraged them to believe that the U.S. was divided internally, the U.S. was weak, the U.S. was polarized, that the divide between the U.S. and our European allies within NATO was a chasm, and that there would not be a cost associated with it. And that's why I think President Trump has blood on his hands. And that's why I think the American public will hold him accountable going forward. Him and the Republican elites that supported Putin will be held accountable going into the future elections.
I think you're saying something here that's pretty heavy. So I just want to make sure I understand it completely, and you say it as simply as you can. You're saying, if I understand you correctly, that the phone call, the block, and the aftermath set in motion such American division over the future of Ukraine that this signaled to Putin that he could be green-lighted for an invasion of his neighbor. Is that fair? A fair recap of what you just told me?
That's right. I would put it in more stark terms. I think President Trump and his captured Republican Party have blood on their hands. There is a direct logic to Putin's actions and this war based on the actions of these Republicans and Donald Trump, and they are complicit in this war.
Now, Republicans on Capitol Hill are very frequently saying, and quite loudly, that if President Trump had won a second term, there would have been no invasion of Ukraine. And conversely, that it's Biden administration weakness that gave Putin the confidence he needed to make this audacious move.
Well, that's just a bunch of nonsense, smoke and mirrors, to distract from the fact that the Republican Party in the hours before this war was cheerleading for Putin, talking about his genius and how great a leader he was. In fact, what I could say is clear to me. If Trump had won, if Trump had stolen the 2020 elections, if Trump had realized his scheme to tarnish Biden, he probably could have won the second election, frankly, because Biden was his most serious challenger, in a way, most acceptable to the largest swath of the American population. If he had won, either through that corruption scheme in the first scandal, or by trying to steal it in the actual election cycle and through January 6th, we would have ended up in a world where NATO would have quickly unraveled. There would not have been a coherent response to Russian aggression, and frankly, Vladimir Putin could have picked off any number of countries at his leisure. It wouldn't have been just Ukraine. It would, frankly, with Donald Trump's blessing, because Donald Trump was talking about how genius it was for Putin to claim the eastern portion of Ukraine. Those are his words. Hours before the attack, he would have went after Moldova. He would have potentially went after. I think there's an excellent chance he would have went after the Baltic states, because Estonia, in particular, is very, very close to Russia's second city, St. Petersburg. And I think we would have been in a world where Russia would have started to reconstitute, with Trump's blessing, the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire.
Let's go back to February and the weeks leading up to the invasion. The United States did a very interesting thing. It took its best intelligence and revealed it not only to its friends, who were often publicly still dubious about the possibility of an invasion, in NATO, where there were people in Europe saying, oh, no, he's not really going to invade. But they also showed this intelligence to the Chinese, a worldwide competitor, you might say, uh, hoping that they could enlist Xi Jinping in trying to dissuade Putin from taking that momentous step. This is not in any intelligence or statecraft textbook. This was pretty interesting. Eventually, Putin made the choice to invade anyway, but has the United States played what in many ways is a not straightforward hand reasonably well, given the facts on the ground as they are?
I think they have, and they deserve credit for that. I find myself, weighing in with some constructive criticism, in that if the intelligence, and this is something I basically said that this war is going to happen starting in November. I wrote a New York Times piece about the fact that there's little that we potentially could still do to avoid it, but we need to do a lot more to at least attempt to. We did. I'm of two minds on this one. I think the revealing of intelligence is critically important. It's one of the unique features of this war, how much of it's playing out in the information space, how much of it was effective in undermining Putin's rationale for conducting the war, preventing him from building the case within his own public, within the international community, to kind of sow discord and stymie a resolved, powerful response to Russia. That is all, absolutely amazing. And frankly, we talk about the U.S., but if the U.S. kind of did the first series of successful steps in this direction, Vladimir Zelensky has masterfully picked up that mantle and taken it to a whole new level with regards to building consensus around punishing Russia. It's his activities and the iron will of the Ukrainian people to defend themselves. Zelensky taking a leading role in rallying Europe and rallying the U.S. around pushing back on Russia. If that's the case, my criticism falls on the fact that there was a strong defeatist streak in the weeks leading up to this war, weeks and months, that the U.S. couldn't do anything, that the U.S. That it was a foregone conclusion that Ukraine would lose, and therefore our position outside the information space was to do very little, to be hands off, and inaction is an action of its own, and I think we could have done more. That's a lesson that we should learn from. Right now, we're trickling in assistance, we're trickling in aid, and the inaction is a action of its own here also. We should be arming the Ukrainians to do a lot more to defend themselves. And, so it's a continuous kind of a thread in my mind, a logic thread in my mind, that we shouldn't be defeatist. We're the sole superpower. We could play a constructive role in preserving Ukraine's sovereignty and independence. And we need to play that role, not just sit it out.
But that hesitation that you describe and that you've called out publicly, that comes from a rational place, doesn't it? The idea that the more aid that goes directly from the United States into Ukraine, the more the United States is drawn into a direct confrontation with Russia. Perhaps a just one in the view of many policymakers, but still one that's incredibly risky at the same time.
I think that's honestly a unsophisticated view, absent of history and precedent. And that sounds a lot kind of more provocative than I'm not. I think this is something that my years of study of this suggest, that there are rules to this game. Russia and the Soviet Union engaged in a proxy war with the U.S. on multiple occasions. They flew pilots and planes against us in Korea directly. I mean, there was a little bit of smoke and mirrors about the fact that these were North Korean pilots, but they flew them and they flew their planes against us. We're not doing anything remotely that provocative. In Vietnam, they operated the air defense batteries that knocked out so many of our pilots flying over Vietnam. That didn't precipitate a larger war. We armed the Mujahideen with weapons. That didn't precipitate a broader war. So there was a way to do this and arm Ukraine, in proxy warfare without really risking anything substantial. My problem is this: I kind of laid out this I think incontrovertible premise that it's our inaction for 22 years of Putin's rule that kind of precipitated this confrontation. It was increasingly provocative, and we were weak-kneed in responding. The same goes in this situation. If we are not sufficiently muscular in our support to Ukraine, that is a vulnerability for Vladimir Putin to exploit, and that also drags out this war. Let's think about where we started 4 weeks ago. Offering these kamikaze drones was out of the question. Sanctioning the central bank was out of the question. SWIFT sanctions were out of the question. Those are the easy decisions. We've kind of ran out of the easy decisions. It's only going to get harder from here. And Putin is going to ratchet up the pressure. He's going to probe for vulnerabilities. The longer this war goes, the riskier it gets. We cannot be short-sighted and have wishful thinking about the fact that this is going to stay at this level. It's going to ratchet up. There's going to be a greater devastation of Ukrainian cities. There's going to be greater pressure on our European allies to do more, the ones that are feeling most vulnerable, the Baltics, Poland, that are receiving millions of refugees, the ones that believe that they're next if Russia is successful there. They're going to go in alone anyway. In my view, there's a very good chance that Poland just decides to do something, whether it's peacekeepers or more provocative arms. It's a matter of time, and that has direct implications on our security. So my point is, let's take some bold, risk-informed decisions now, because these are the easy decisions. It's only going to get harder the longer this war goes.
An interesting thing about risk. One of the hallmarks of the Biden administration response over the past few months has been to place a very high priority on keeping the Western allies together, not to be too far out ahead of them or too far behind them. Even if it took longer to achieve a policy objective, you had to wait to get the Germans finally to give you the missing buy-in on Nord Stream. You had to wait to get the Italians, who were very exposed, to give you the buy-in on the SWIFT limitations, freezing of central bank assets. And that has proven to have a value. We are really all in this together. It's not
Agreed.
A divided NATO that that Vladimir Putin faces. Okay, so you've achieved that goal. How do you leverage it now?
Sure.
Can you engineer something with the MiG-29s in Poland? Can you create a corridor for both humanitarian and military aid through the eastern flank of NATO? Now that you've built this goodwill, what do you do with it?
Well, what's interesting, and this is another thing that there's a lot of credit being given to, justifiably, to the Biden administration for their declassification and release of information. The other thing, it's a little bit more kind of conceptual, but they did build a massive consensus. They laid the groundwork for this response from NATO. We've trailed to a certain extent Europe as of late in terms of levying some sanctions. They were the ones that were willing to do the central bank sanctions. They were the ones that were willing to go to SWIFT when we were reluctant. A lot of that was because of Vladimir Zelensky's leadership. But we laid the groundwork for that. The U.S., the Biden administration laid the groundwork for all these things to unfold. The problem is that now you have different perceptions about the risks here. I think the blinders are off from the Germans. The blinders are off from the French and wishful thinking about the fact that this war, they had doubts about whether this war was going to unfold. But there's a difference between, let's say, Poland, that shares a border with Belarus and with Ukraine, and Germany and France, and what they're willing to do. There's a wishful thinking about the fact that we could return to a world before this war. And that's impossible for me. To me, it's clear that we're in a Cold War, trying to avoid a hot war, and that in order to do that, there's more that we need to do to help the Ukrainians win it on the battlefields in Ukraine. And I think the Biden administration still has some wishful thinking about a return to normal. The Biden administration has some misplaced ideas on the real risks of escalation, that somehow this spirals into a nuclear war. That's implausible. Yes, the risks of a nuclear war are catastrophic, but they're catastrophic for everybody. Therefore, the probability of a nuclear war remains very, 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 very low because of mutually assured destruction. So the fact that we stumble into it's more likely that we stumble into a conventional and nuclear war over a long-term trajectory. As history has suggested in World War I and World War II, we were eventually dragged into these protracted wars. Then the risks associated with arming Ukraine to swiftly end this campaign, and that's by providing the things that help equalize the battlefield, help them knock out planes, help through air defenses, help them knock out missiles with unmanned combat aerial vehicles, or these MiG-29s. These are not really risky decisions. You get riskier when you talk about no-fly zones, because then you have a direct confrontation. But providing Ukraine with equipment is not a high threshold. It's nowhere near the threshold for war with Russia.
I want to go back to what you said earlier about the defeatism, because I think it did contribute a lot. I don't think I'd use the word defeatism, but let's say the handicapping of the way it was going to go once a war started. There was the assumption that giant Russia, with its legacy military, was just going to roll over the smaller, less well-equipped, less deeply blooded Ukrainian military. And that you put a lot of store in making sure the invasion didn't happen at all, rather than preparing Ukraine for what happened if the invasion did occur. I agree. That sort of assumption that Russia was going to make quick work of Ukraine guided a lot of what was being said in foreign capitals in January and February. Now that Ukraine is actually starting to retake territory first seized by Russians, slowing the advance around some of the major cities, killing a lot of Russians, frankly, does that make it, as a reward for plucky Ukraine holding off its bigger neighbor, does that make it even more dangerous down the road for Ukraine? Does this take off the cuffs for Vladimir Putin to tell his commanders in the field to be even less respectful of civilian populations, to be even less careful about destroying historic patrimony, to be even less worried about what the place looks like after he's done? Does fighting back make Russia even more dangerous?
You know, it's interesting. I think that the way you led off that question, you started talking about this. In a way, it kind of couched it as limited to Russia and Ukraine. It's not. This has much bigger implications. We were on the cusp of a world where the geopolitical challenges facing the United States would be multiplied manyfold. We were on the cusp of a world where the powerful could prey on the weak. China was more likely to go into Taiwan. Iran was more likely to target its neighbors. That's the kind of world that we were shaping up to live in, but for the valiant, amazing defense of the Ukrainian people of their homeland, of democracy. They are fighting for our democracy. They are fighting for our way of life, for our prosperity. That is a amazing. They saved our bacon, big time. That it was going to be a much, much more dangerous world. We need to be probably a little bit more appreciative of what that means, because their success is the success of democracies. It's the putting of authoritarian regimes on their heels. It's the authoritarian regimes having to really be a little bit more introspective than they're likely to be about what their failed assumptions are. If the second most powerful military in the world is defeated on the battlefield, we're still some time away from that, and we should be playing a constructive role in helping the Ukrainians. We're not in the way that we should. We are providing what on paper looks like a lot of aid, but it's just in time. It's being trickled in, not in the quantities that they need it, and not in the systems that they need. What this means is that it gives Russia a chance to, instead of reeling and having to quickly recalculate what is achievable, it gives them time to adapt. It gives the Russian army a time to adapt. It gives the Russians the ability to think about conscription and to draw on these massive, deep depots of Soviet era equipment. That there are thousands and thousands of pieces. The stuff that's being destroyed on the Ukrainian battlefields is modern stuff. Like their best stuff is being destroyed on the Ukrainian battlefields, but they have like almost endless supplies of other tanks and armored vehicles in depots. And the Russians very well are thinking through those. The sooner this ends, the sooner that the Ukrainians are able to defeat Russia's most capable formations on the battlefield, which is to a certain extent what's going on. It's actually not being, entirely well represented in the U.S. Media or by the U.S. government, because the U.S. government's, frankly, I understand how it works. That I understand how battle damage assessment works and how they're calculating, only that Russia has lost 10% of its combat power. It's lost vastly more than that in terms of personnel and equipment. It's probably somewhere on the order of 20 to maybe even 30%. Some formations are just no longer combat effective. Other formations are still viable and can still fight. But the sooner we allow the Ukrainians to decisively defeat on the Ukrainian battlefields, the quicker this comes to a conclusion where Vladimir Putin is either compelled to negotiate in good faith or withdraws, saying that, look, I ruined all these cities. I destroyed the Ukrainian military. They no longer have a military-industrial complex. Congratulations, Russian army. Time to go home. We'll throw you a victory parade. He could do that. That's probably the way this, frankly, ends ultimately. Briefly, I'll mention that the biggest mismatches are in air power, so planes, helicopters, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and these naval vessels that are off of Russia's shore, or off of Ukraine's shores, that the Ukrainians can't even touch. If we help the Ukrainians, even the score in some of these areas, that's how we compel. That's how the Ukrainians compel Russia, not us. We're a bit player here, the U.S. We're providing some material support. That's how we help the Ukrainians compel the Russians to negotiate.
When the smoke clears, I wonder what kind of world Vladimir Putin will face. If these sanctions go on for much longer, they are going to bite harder and harder over time. Some of them are designed to just be worse in April and May than they are now, as sort of stockpiled supplies of cash in various sectors begin to run out, and parts begin to run out, and feedstock begins to run out. A world where Putin was hoping for a less united NATO will have a more united NATO. A world where Putin was hoping for a less united EU, he'll face a more united and perhaps even enlarged EU. So many of the big goals here, besides just ridding himself of the irritant of an elected government right on his flank, will have not just been lost, but catastrophically lost. Yes. And he'll be sort of a pariah. How do you dig yourself out of that hole? I wonder, not about April and May, though I'm fascinated to see what happens. I wonder about next April and May, and the one after that.
So thank you, Volodymyr Zelensky. Thank you, Ukrainian people, for casting the world in this direction, where the threats to U.S. security with a defeated Russia are reduced, not increased. It could have easily turned out differently. It could have easily turned out differently with Trump realizing his schemes. But that's not the world we have to face now. The Ukrainians have given us a chance for a U.S. with a stronger partnerships with Europe, with other democracies, and an isolated Russia. As long as Putin's in power, as long as Putin's in power, Russia will be a pariah. Russia will be subject to sanctions. These are not just government sanctions. These are commercial entities willing to take billions of dollars in write-offs to get out of that market. And to me, this is the beginning of the end of Vladimir Putin. The fears and the things I wrote about even in June or July when I wrote about the summit between Biden and Putin was that we have to get to use the reality of Vladimir Putin in power until 2036. 2 more presidential terms after this one in 2024. I don't think we have to contend with that. I think he has an expiration date. He is likely, he's not going to be able to maybe even survive the rest of his tenure here, let alone 2 more presidential terms, because of the catastrophic consequences of this war, uniting the democratic world against him, breeding economic isolation, devastating losses on the battlefields. I think that those things are just simply not going to allow him to survive for much longer.
Well, lest I sound callous, and please, if you're listening to this, don't think I've forgotten the Ukrainian people. Massive internal displacement, just incalculable damage to the stuff of everyday life. Apartment buildings, factories, garages, automobiles, train lines, roads. This is going to be a wrecked country when it's done. How does that get fixed?
So this is one just reminded me. This is the thing that I meant to. This is the thing that I frankly want to talk about on a habitual basis now, because we should be thinking beyond. My advice is always think beyond the next couple of days, next couple of weeks. We need to start thinking about Ukraine that exits this war as a sovereign and independent state, but destroyed. And we need to start thinking about reconstruction now. There are a couple of critical pieces to that reconstruction. The European Union already is discussing $100 billion euro reconstruction fund. The U.S. is going to come in with probably tens of billions of dollars also to rebuild Ukraine into a modern 21st century, probably about one of the most modern states in the world by the time that the reconstruction is done. Part of that is going to be these assets that are blocked. They need to be forfeited by the oligarchs and by the Russian government, so seized and transferred over to Ukraine for reconstruction. And we need to start planning for that. That's not part of the discussion right now. We're still talking about this war that's likely to last weeks and months, and what we need to do. But we also need to start thinking creatively about the aftermath, and that's not going on. And that's where we need to get this administration to be a little bit more thoughtful.
What dictates, and this will be my final question, what dictates the pace going forward? Who's in charge of the answer to the question, how long is this going to continue?
It's the Ukrainians with the support of, it's the 3 major kind of factions. It's the Ukrainians with NATO and US support. So that's 2 there. And it's Putin and his willingness to bleed his army white. I think the Ukrainians are by far the decisive factor. As long as they have the morale and the will to fight, they will stymie Russia's military aims, its political aims, but they need to be armed to do that. Otherwise, this devolves into even a more brutal campaign with street house-to-house fighting, street-to-street fighting in the cities. But I think the Ukrainians are the biggest factor here. We need to support the Ukrainians to help them protect their country and protect the free world with our support. That's the least we could do, sitting on the sidelines. I don't think that's an unreasonable position for us to attempt to sit this one out. I have my doubts as to whether we'll be able to do it, But if we do that, then we need to give Ukraine what it needs to fight. That is the least we could do, and then that's what forces Vladimir Putin to bring this war to an end.
Retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman has been my guest. He's the author of Here, Right Matters. He joined us from California. He's currently a PhD candidate at the School for Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. You've been very generous with your time. Great to talk to you again. Good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. It was a great conversation.
Thanks to our YouTube audience this hour on the program, an experiment, and one that I hope that you'll join us for in future. You should know that if you want people you know, or if you enjoyed it and you want to recommend it to others, we'll be turning 2 episodes of the World Affairs podcast out of this conversation with Colonel Vindman. And in future, of course, the World Affairs radio program heard on public radio stations and, of course, on our production home, KQED FM in San Francisco. Thanks to everybody who made this hour of the program possible. Good to talk to you all, and come back. See us again.
Thanks. Bye.